It was just after 10 p.m. when Maya Richardson stepped out of the rideshare and into the glow of the Grand Crest Hotel's awning, her heels clicking on the rain-slicked marble as she approached the gilded entrance with the quiet confidence of someone who had conquered more in a decade than most did in a lifetime. Her flight had been grounded due to unexpected storms sweeping across Georgia, and with every major hotel near Hartsfield-Jackson booked solid, she'd hoped the old-world charm of this boutique property, long known for its exclusivity, might finally work in her favor. But she hadn't even stepped 2 feet inside before she sensed the change in temperature. Not from the cold, but from the practiced smile of the front desk clerk who stiffened upon seeing her, a young white man in a navy vest and slicked back hair who looked her up and down as if trying to compute why someone like her was standing in his lobby, looking so certain, so put together, so absolutely out of place in his eyes. She smiled politely, offered her credit card and ID, and asked if there were any rooms available for the evening, explaining her travel predicament with the same gracious professionalism she'd used in hundreds of boardrooms across the country. But he barely glanced at her ID before sliding it back and saying flatly, "Unfortunately, we're fully booked tonight," his tone perfunctory, dismissive, rehearsed. Not the tone of someone delivering bad news, but of someone weaponizing policy to mask prejudice. Maya glanced at the reservation board behind him, which still showed 2 executive suites available, information she'd seen on their website moments earlier, and she calmly asked to speak to a manager, to which the clerk sighed and leaned in, lowering his voice so no one else would hear. "Ma'am, I don't think this is the kind of place you're looking for," his words hanging in the air like smoke in a locked room. Around her, lobby guests stared awkwardly, a few averting their eyes while others watched with a blend of discomfort and curiosity, as if this were a spectacle they'd seen before. Maya felt the familiar sting of degradation, but she didn't argue or plead. She simply gathered her belongings, nodded once, and walked out into the rain with her head high, the clerk already turning back to his monitor like she had never existed. She stood beneath the hotel's awning for a long moment, her breath visible in the cold air, her phone buzzing with alerts, her mind already moving faster than her heart, because this wasn't just about a hotel room. This was about every time she had been overlooked, underestimated, or quietly dismissed by people who didn't know her power, didn't know her reach, didn't know that the woman they had just tried to make invisible was a multi-million-dollar real estate developer, investor and CEO of one of the most successful black-owned property firms in the Southeast. She called her driver, got in the back seat, and as the car pulled away from the curb, she pulled up the Grand Crest's LLC registration, ownership history, tax records, and the most recent filings of the property's financials, things most people wouldn't know how to find. But Maya had built her empire by knowing exactly where to look, and within 10 minutes, she knew something the smug desk clerk didn't. The Grand Crest was not only vulnerable, it was for sale quietly and without public listing, through a distressed portfolio held by a regional developer desperate to offload their crumbling assets. She texted her lawyer, her business manager, and her private banker before she even got home, and by midnight, she had arranged a call with the hotel's holding company set for first thing in the morning. She didn't sleep that night, not because she was angry, but because she was energized, activated, driven by the knowledge that the fastest way to end a cycle of exclusion wasn't to beg for access, but to own the doors they tried to keep locked. By sunrise, she was in a tailored navy suit at her firm's conference table, sipping coffee while her lawyer walked her through the terms of the deal. The holding company wanted out. The property had been bleeding money, and the right offer, especially one in cash, would close the matter by day's end. Maya made her move swiftly, decisively, matching the asking price and even offering to absorb the hotel's outstanding debts if it meant the deal could be expedited. By noon, she had signed the agreement, wired the funds, and received the documents, proving her full ownership of the building, its assets, its name, and every inch of its land. She didn't gloat, didn't post a photo, didn't tell the world. She simply called her driver again, returned to the Grand Crest just before the evening rush, and walked through the lobby doors with a leather folder in one hand and the poise of a woman who was now exactly where she was meant to be. When the same clerk looked up and locked eyes with her, confusion flashed across his face as Maya walked straight to the front desk, opened the folder, and quietly laid the deed on the counter, saying, I believe we met last night. This time I won't be needing a room. I own the building now." Silence swept the lobby. The clerk's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and staff nearby paused what they were doing as Maya smiled politely, her voice calm but resonant. "Please inform your general manager there will be a mandatory staff meeting in 1 hour. Effective immediately, the Grand Crest is under new ownership." Maya Richardson stood in the staff conference room of the Grand Crest Hotel, the same place where employee schedules were once handed out, grievances quietly buried, and dismissals signed without second thought. Only now, it was her space, and, as the hotel's staff filed in one by one, whispering in hushed tones, casting side glances at the sharply dressed woman standing confidently at the head of the table, the very air seemed to shift. Some recognized her from the night before, others merely sensed the tension, but none were prepared for what came next when she calmly introduced herself, not as a guest, but as the new owner of the entire establishment, holding in her hand the signed acquisition papers and deed transfer that had been filed that very morning, triggering a collective silence that fell across the room like the last note of a funeral bell. And then she spoke, her voice warm, measured, and resolute, explaining that she hadn't come for revenge or theatrics, but for restoration, for accountability, for transformation. And though her acquisition had been sparked by the discrimination she experienced at their front desk, her mission ran deeper, rooted in her belief that institutions, especially historic ones, must evolve or dissolve, and that if they continued to reflect the biases of the past, they had no business surviving. The future. She laid out her vision. The Grand Crest would undergo a full rebrand, a cultural and operational overhaul, beginning with a top-down audit of hiring practices, pay equity, staff diversity, and guest treatment protocols. And while many employees looked fearful, she assured them this wasn't a purge. It was an awakening, an opportunity to build something better, more inclusive, more just. But she also made it clear there would be no tolerance for prejudice hiding behind professionalism. And then she turned directly to the young front desk clerk, Ethan, who had tried to deny her a room the night before, not with venom in her voice, but with firm clarity, recounting exactly what he had said and how he said it, his cheeks flushing crimson as the room's eyes turned toward him. She offered him a choice, not a threat but a path. Enroll immediately in a company-funded cultural competency and equity leadership course with progress and sincerity monitored over time, or resign voluntarily with severance, no animosity but no return. Ethan, clearly shaken and perhaps beginning to understand the magnitude of his error, chose the training, his voice quiet but sincere, and Maya nodded, pivoting back to the broader group, now laying out her 90-day plan, which included opening the hotel's ground floor to local black-owned vendors and artists, offering scholarships for hotel management to underrepresented students, updating decor to reflect inclusive luxury, and building partnerships with tourism boards to welcome a more diverse clientele. Within 72 hours, word of her bold ownership spread beyond Atlanta, amplified by local bloggers and then by national business outlets eager to showcase the woman who turned racism into real estate power, who flipped the script not by shouting but by buying the microphone, who made inclusion profitable, tangible, and non-negotiable. But for Maya, the real reward wasn't headlines. It was the quiet moments, watching older staff members approach her to thank her for finally bringing justice where whispers of mistreatment had long been ignored, reading emails from young black professionals who said they'd never felt safe entering the Grand Crest until now, and seeing the transformation ripple beyond her intentions as guests from all walks of life started walking through the doors and seeing themselves reflected in the new atmosphere, the art, the staff, the energy. The property began hosting book clubs, small business pop-ups, and community forums, and under Maya's guidance, revenue spiked, not just from curiosity, but from trust, loyalty, and pride from patrons who believed in her mission and the hotel's new heartbeat. The rebrand officially launched under its new name, the Richardson Grand, a tribute to Maya's mother, who had once cleaned rooms at a roadside motel to pay rent and feed her daughter's dreams, and now her name was etched into brass plates, printed on embossed menus, and spoken with admiration by a city that had once tried to keep women like her out of luxury spaces altogether. Maya walked those halls daily, not as a distant figurehead but as a present force, engaging guests, mentoring junior staff, and slowly, brick by brick, rewriting the story of what power looks like, what ownership feels like, and how leadership, true leadership, isn't about vengeance but about legacy. And in those moments, even as competitors tried to replicate her model or critics tried to dismiss it as a PR stunt, she stood unmoved, unbothered, and utterly assured of one truth. She hadn't just purchased a hotel, she had claimed a corner of history, and she was just getting started. As weeks turned into months, and Maya Richardson's transformation of the once elitist Grand Crest into the newly christened Richardson Grand took root, the ripples of that one humiliating night had grown into waves of cultural and economic change, not only inside the hotel's historic walls, but throughout Atlanta's hospitality industry, and even further beyond, into the boardrooms, think tanks, and policy circles where Maya was increasingly being invited to speak, consulted by city leaders who wanted to understand how a single act of silent discrimination had birthed one of the most talked-about hospitality reinventions in the South. What began as whispers turned into national attention, with Forbes running a front-page feature on her titled "The Woman Who Bought Back Her Dignity and the Hotel Too," and while others saw her rise as meteoric, Maya knew it had been anything but. It was decades in the making, a life built on resilience, systems literacy, and a quiet understanding of how to navigate white spaces with black brilliance. Her hotel now buzzed with a new kind of clientele. Authors, artists, tech founders, civic leaders, celebrities seeking authenticity over opulence, and more importantly, local black families who came just to walk the halls and feel like royalty, in a space that once told them, "You don't belong." Her staff diversity had increased by 40%, not as a quota but as a natural result of equitable recruitment, mentorship, and real investment in human potential, and the once indifferent employees were now proud ambassadors of a brand that stood for dignity. The former clerk, Ethan, had not only completed his training but stayed on, transformed by proximity to purpose and humbled by Maya's willingness to offer grace when she could have chosen retribution. He became a vocal advocate for equity, and while Maya didn't forget his insult, she respected his growth. But not all reactions were celebratory. There were lawsuits, bitter former stakeholders, anonymous threats, and even subtle sabotage from nearby competitors and old money families who didn't like that some girl with a property fund and a chip on her shoulder had turned a symbol of exclusion into a sanctuary of empowerment. But Maya, who had grown up dodging far worse than boardroom politics, didn't flinch. She knew that disruption always bred resistance, and the louder the critics got, the more clearly she understood that her presence alone had challenged generations of silent gatekeeping. One particularly sharp moment came during a private event, hosted at her hotel for elite investors. Among them, a white male CEO of a tech firm who, unaware of who she was, made a snide remark about the hotel's urban rebranding and gentrified diversity push, only for Maya to step onto the stage moments later as keynote speaker, locking eyes with him and saying, "To those who think inclusion is a marketing tactic, allow me to introduce you to profit rooted in principle," earning a standing ovation and an immediate walkout from the man whose ego couldn't survive a woman he'd tried to minimize. Yet Maya remained unshaken, reminding her team after every slight, every challenge, that the mission was bigger than her feelings. It was about reclaiming narrative, space, and legacy for every young girl who'd ever been told she wasn't enough, and every woman who'd ever had to smile through insult to keep her job, her peace, or her sanity. One especially moving afternoon, an elderly black woman arrived with her granddaughter, quietly asking the concierge if she could walk the lobby, explaining that she used to clean these floors 50 years ago when she wasn't allowed to use the front door as a guest. When Maya heard, she came down herself, gave the woman a full tour, and insisted she and her granddaughter dine on the house in the best suite the hotel had, treating her like the royalty she had always been, just unseen. It was in those moments, not the articles or the panels or the praise, that Maya felt the weight of what she'd done, not just acquiring square footage or forcing a policy shift, but bending time, memory, and history toward healing. She had proven that power doesn't need permission. and that true ownership was never just about buildings. It was about agency, dignity, and presence. And still, she remained forward-focused, holding meetings with city leaders to expand her vision into new developments that would center Black communities, launching an accelerator program for Black and brown hospitality entrepreneurs, and setting her sights on the next acquisition, because as she told her team one morning over coffee, in the now renovated rooftop lounge, "The mission didn't end the day I bought this hotel. It began the moment they told me I didn't belong here." And with every step, Maya was writing a new script, not just for herself, but for a generation watching her show the world how Black women don't just demand seats at the table. They build the table, own the land it sits on, and name the building after their mothers. Maya Richardson stood on the rooftop terrace of the Richardson Grand, overlooking the vibrant heart of Atlanta as the city pulsed with evening light. Her reflection mirrored faintly in the glass railings alongside the illuminated letters of her hotel's name, and for the first time in years she allowed herself a breath. Not of relief, but of reckoning, because though the storm had passed, the echoes of its winds were still around her, in the conversations she sparked, in the systems she shook, and in the culture she reshaped, one policy, one story, one door at a time. And now, that quiet breath was broken by applause rising behind her, as the final panel of the Legacy and Leadership Summit concluded. A 3-day event Maya had organized not only to showcase what her hotel had become, but to gather Black women founders, hotel owners, former domestic workers turned entrepreneurs, and quiet warriors who had never had a platform. Until now, when she gave them one with velvet chairs, floral-lit stages, and contracts inked over mimosas and business cards passed, like promises of futures no longer deferred. In that moment, she wasn't just an owner. She was a curator of a new reality, a conductor of power's redefinition, and it was in that spirit that she took the mic one final time before the crowd, her words both gentle and galvanizing, telling the story not of her vengeance but of her vision, of how a single no from a front desk clerk had given her the fuel to deliver a generational yes, not just for herself, but for the women behind her, beside her, and rising because of her. She announced the launch of the Rising Keys Fund, a multi-million-dollar grant and mentorship initiative aimed at helping marginalized women purchase and transform commercial real estate, hotels, cafes, event spaces, reclaiming the very spaces they'd been pushed out of, and the crowd erupted because it was no longer just about Maya's hotel. It was about a movement. Yet, as always, Maya remained grounded. Even as investors lined up, media outlets requested interviews, and former critics suddenly wanted to collaborate, because she remembered the exhaustion of invisibility, the ache of being underestimated, the sting of smiling through humiliation just to survive another day. And that memory kept her decisions sharp and her mission clear. So when a former Grand Crest board member, who had once laughed at the idea of a Black woman owning a legacy brand, sent a private invitation for her to join an elite hotel council, Maya sent a reply that simply said, "Only if the panel reflects the communities it profits from." And when they declined, she created her own coalition, one that partnered with global diversity coalitions and travel equity groups to set new international standards. And by the end of the fiscal year, Maya's model had not only surpassed industry benchmarks for inclusive revenue growth, but had become case study material at Harvard Business School, where professors once skeptical of emotional entrepreneurship now lectured on her strategic empathy as a model of sustainable leadership. The Richardson Grand had transformed from an artifact of exclusion to an ecosystem of belonging, hosting family reunions where elders were treated like ambassadors, high-end weddings where guests danced barefoot on balconies under open skies, and Black history events where ancestors were remembered not as trauma, but as triumph. And yet, Maya never let the glamour cloud the ground beneath her, still making surprise rounds through the kitchen, still sitting with housekeepers over tea to hear their worries, still sending handwritten notes to guests whose stories touched her spirit. One afternoon she received a letter from a teenage girl named Layla, who had visited with her mother, and wrote that seeing Maya made her believe she could own more than just dreams. And Maya cried quietly in her office, realizing this was the harvest she'd sowed. Not just bookings, but belief. And when finally the same clerk who once refused her entry now her operations assistant, walked into her office with tears in his eyes and said, "Thank you for showing me what justice can look like." She nodded and replied, "Now show someone else," because Maya had never believed in gatekeeping success, only in multiplying it. And so, as the sun dipped low, casting golden shadows on the city she had reshaped by sheer will, grit, and brilliance, Maya closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel the fullness of what she had built. Not just a hotel reclaimed, but an empire. Reimagined, a legacy written not in marble or silk, but in every single person who now walked into her hotel, stood tall, and said without hesitation, "I belong here."